It is Wednesday, November 1st, 2017. My name is Ashton Ellett. I'm here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Program, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Here today with Jay Morgan, principal of the J.L. Morgan Company. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just to begin with, tell us a little bit about your childhood, upbringing, where you grew up, where you learned your love of politics.
Well, I grew up in Talbotton, Georgia, one of the smaller, the other Georgia, I guess you would say, smaller cities, counties.
The Kingdom of
Georgia.
West Georgia over there.
Yeah, right. And growing up there, my father and my grandfather were both small business entrepreneurs. And my grandfather had a small country store. I spent a lot of time in that store as a child growing up. And my grandfather didn't have many hobbies, outside interests other than running the store and the little oil distributorship that he started. But he loved politics, and we would sit and talk in the store when there wouldn't be many customers, or candidates would come through, and he'd talk about it. And then he ran for county commissioner once himself, lost, ran again, lost. But he was very interested, and I remember we used to sit at his breakfast table. He'd come in late at night from the store, and we would talk about politics and talk about the different people in politics. He had been Carl Sanders' county chairman when Carl Sanders ran for governor, and he maintained an active interest in it. He just was never able to find the niche that he wanted there. So that's probably spurred an early interest in it for me. I tend to tell people that my brother wanted to play baseball and I wanted to play politics. So through a lot of things that I got involved in high school and college, I found my way into the business.
So what are your earliest memories of campaigns, elections in Georgia? Do you remember? Because some people can remember watching these election returns on NBC with Brinkley and everybody counting the votes.
One of my earliest memories would probably be in '68 when I remember I was in grammar school, and the candidates, of course, that was Wallace, Nixon, Humphrey, '68. And there was a poll in the class, where everybody got to vote. And I was the only person in the class who voted for Nixon. Yeah. Everybody else voted for, George Wallace, and there were a couple of guys.
I'm going to assume Wallace romped to victory in the Talbotons.
He did, in my small little Talbot County school. And I remember one of the kids running up to me on the playground afterwards and saying, the only reason you were for Nixon is because you thought he was going to win.
Interesting bullying point.
Yeah, but I remember watching the conventions with my grandfather, and him trying to explain things to me, he and my grandmother both. And I remember Spiro Agnew being picked as a running mate for some reason. Why, I don't know. But I just started following it, even after that, and I've always been interested in it and intrigued by the process.
Okay, so you went off to University of Georgia.
Yep.
Late 1970s.
Yep.
Early 80s. Were you involved in campaigns here in Athens?
Not a lot, because we were going through that kind of strange period where, student government, that was the time of the unknown candidate, when student government was basically, disbanded and everyone else. So I remember trying to get involved in that, then it kind of went away. And then my outlet for politics in college became fraternity politics.
Oh.
And, I was president of my
IFC.
fraternity. Yep, IFC helped.
Some nasty politics on IFC.
Yep, I helped overthrow the slate, one year, and that was one of the last things I remember being involved in. But it became the entry point for me in state Republican politics, because one of the guys that I got to know through Interfraternity Council was dating a girl whose dad was going to run for governor, 1982. Bob Bell.
Well, that answered that question.
Yep. And he introduced me to Bob. Bob interviewed me, and I was chomping at the bit to get involved, and offered me a job in his campaign for governor in 1981, and to the dismay of my parents and a lot of my friends, I took it on because I was just I was ready to go.
Were they dismayed that you were getting into politics, or were they dismayed that you were getting into Republican politics?
Both. My dad wanted me to go to law school, and my mom was just like, I'm the firstborn. And like, what are you doing? Because Bob's campaign didn't have any money. It was $100 a week. I lived in an unair-conditioned garage apartment that belonged to the same friend who introduced me to Bob through his fiancée at the time, and but it was just I seemed to always have this soft spot for underdogs, and that was one of them. And it was 82 was a terrible year to be running as a Republican for anything, but especially running for governor in Georgia.
Well, so what was your role with the campaign?
I was everything. I was the only staff person for the first 6-9 months. I think I became the title they gave me after the first 6 months was campaign coordinator, because I wasn't old enough to be campaign manager. I was 22 years old, I guess, but there was no staff. Late in the campaign there was some staff came in. There was a campaign manager whose name, but I basically scheduled and did events and set up events.
The leg man.
Exactly.
Or a contemporary term that's in the news today, a low-level staffer.
Yeah, very well said.
So you come out of that campaign, 82, obviously run into the buzzsaw that is Joe Frank Harris.
Yep.
A low-energy buzzsaw, but a buzzsaw.
Right.
What'd you do? I've seen, full disclosure, I've seen your papers and stuff, and you were obviously scrambling to find a job.
Yep, I was.
I can relate to these things. How did you settle into your next?
I was very lucky. After the 82 campaign, there were special elections in 2 congressional districts due to reapportionment. And one of them was a guy named Dick Winder, who was running for a congressional seat in Metro Atlanta. And the Republican National Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee got very involved in those races, trying to scratch out a win. So I got exposed to some of their staff folks. And as I started interviewing around for different jobs, I thought I wanted to go to Washington, work on a congressional staff. And I remember very clearly one of the guys with the National Committee said, when you're tired of getting doors slammed in your face in D.C., said, call me because I got a job for you. And so I was hard-headed. I kept getting doors slammed in my face in D.C., and finally one day I called him. He said, are you ready? And I was like, yeah, I am. So I went and interviewed, and I was hired as a field guy for the Republican National Committee.
So a field guy. So you've moved up from leg man to field guy.
Yep. They called it local programs director.
Ooh.
And basically the job became many things. For the first 6 months for me, there were legislative elections going on in Mississippi.
Okay.
And that was part of the region that I was assigned to. And so they moved me to Mississippi. I lived there for 6-9 months to recruit legislative candidates in Mississippi. They had even fewer Republicans in the legislature than Georgia did at the time.
They didn't have Atlanta.
Right. But that's where I first met Haley Barbour.
Oh,
and,
okay.
Became a long-term friendship.
What role was he playing at the time?
Haley had run for the United States Senate in Mississippi and lost to Jon Stennis. He'd gotten
one of many.
Right, 32% of the vote. I think he got that in 82, and then his campaign manager went back to a Republican Party in Mississippi to try and pick up the pieces and move forward on a governor's race that they thought they had a chance to win there and try and pick up some legislative seats. And the National Committee wanted to invest in that. It was an odd-year election, and I was hired to help with it.
So what did you take away from your experience, first on the Bell campaign and then as your work, as this regional worker for the RNC? What did you take away about the state of Southern politics, the state of the Republican politics in the South in the early 80s?
What I took away from it was that Georgia was way behind the curve, And the fact that the growth of the party in Georgia had been so retarded by Jimmy Carter's influence and the home state pride for Jimmy Carter, I saw that there were pieces where, when I'd travel in Florida or Tennessee or even some parts of Mississippi and Alabama, that the state party organizations were better organized and better funded. And everywhere I would go, and that's where I first met Lee Atwater, and Lee would say, "What is going on in Georgia? Why can't you guys get it together?" Because South Carolina was better organized than we were, had more members, of the legislature, more congressmen, kind of thing. We had Newt, and that was it.
You mentioned funding. I remember reading a memo. It may have predated your time as executive director, but it was talking about how Mississippi or Alabama had raised $500,000 for the state party, and Georgia had 20 or something like that. I may be wrong. How were Alabama and Mississippi Republicans able to raise that kind of money as opposed to, even those were Democratic states?
Mississippi had a bank draft program, where people could give $10 a month, and it literally got drafted out of your bank account. We didn't have that in Georgia. Alabama had something sort of similar to it. We had none of that. The party in Georgia had been like a small club to a lot of folks. They were only interested in national politics and what it had to offer them. What the nominees or presidents like Nixon and Ford could offer. Individuals, and there'd been very little done to develop any kind of grassroots network that would be a real party apparatus.
That's a good segue into my next question. When you become executive director, first, how did you become executive director? The youngest. I think you've since been surpassed by Carmen.
Yeah.
So how did you become executive director, and then what was the state of the party infrastructure that you found?
I was in my time at the RNC, I was promoted from local programs director to regional finance director.
Okay.
What regional finance director meant was that you went into state party organizations and helped them raise money. I helped them organize the program, that type of thing. And so as I did that, was working with the different party folks, there was a executive director who was not getting along very well with the state chairman here in Georgia. The state chairman was my old boss, Bob Bell, and he was trying to decide whether or not to run for re-election. And I remember we had breakfast at a Shoney's one morning, and he said, "What would it take me?" Exactly. He said, "What would it take to get you to leave the RNC, and become executive director of the party?" And I said, "Well, let's get past the elections, see what happens." So the '84 elections were obviously, great. It was a great time for me personally. I got to attend my first convention, sat on the floor with the Georgia delegation, wore my badge. There were phones on the floor. My parents were watching on TV at home. I was able to call them, and it was I remember standing on the floor of that convention and having tears in my eyes when, Ronald Reagan was accepting, nomination for a second term, and first time that Lee Greenwood stepped out on the stage.
I actually show that music video in my history classes when I'm talking about the 1980s and perceptions.
Yep. So it was very exciting, and so it became a thing with me, particularly with Bob, because I knew Bob, and I knew he was a good man and was a good leader. Bob wanted to talk about issues. Bob didn't know anything about how to organize the party. He just it was a place for him to be and try and stay relevant. But he wanted to do a good job. And so part of it was a loyalty I felt to him. And when he offered me the job, I said, well, let's see what we can do. And I knew my boss at the time would be supportive of it because he had been state director of his own.
Who were you working under?
Lanny Griffith.
Oh,
Yeah, the longtime Mississippi State Party director who then became the regional director. It became the first of several times that I worked for Lanny.
I was going to say that name comes up later on in the 80s.
Yep.
So you're talking about building the party, and the key aspects of the party: fundraising, recruitment, research, targeting, technology. What were the state of those?
We didn't have anything. What what they called a computer at the state party was a word processor. It just kind of could kick out letters. We didn't have a computer at the state party when I took over there in '85. We had a skeletal staff. I got a commitment from Bob that if I could reorganize things and get support from Republican National Committee, that he would let me do whatever we wanted to do with the staff. So we started to reformat that. We had a program that I had helped with in some other states, telemarketing. We introduced that to the state party. I remember reading an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution one Sunday morning about all the new homeowners in Atlanta. We were experiencing growth then, not as we are now, but really solid growth in Georgia in terms of people moving in. And I remember reading about how people were using telemarketing to kind of welcome people to the neighborhood, welcome people to the community, and invite them to open an account at the local bank, invite them to come to the hardware store. So I went to Bob and I was like, well, if they're doing this, why don't we invite them to join the Republican Party? Because a lot of them were from states, moving here from the Midwest and the Northeast, where there was an established presence by the party. And so I was like, let's see if it works for corporate America, maybe it'll work for us. So then we learned that the largest local calling area in the world at that time was Metro Atlanta, where you could, the different area codes. So all the calls that we wanted to make were local calls, which means the calls wouldn't cost us anything.
404.
All we had to do was to put in the phone lines and create a phone bank at the state party, which we did with the help of the Republican National Committee. And it took off like a rocket. And we grew the donor base, which it was about 1,800 people when I took over, and we grew it tenfold.
Was this also the days of direct mail? I think Richard Vigeri and
yeah. As a matter of fact, Carl Rove tried to sell me direct mail. But we had a program that and it made the direct mail vendor nervous because they thought we were going to spend more money on telemarketing than we would on direct mail. But what we found was that once we got a commitment over the phone, we'd send the letter out asking them to fulfill their pledge. Well, then when we folded them into the direct mail file that got mailed, for fundraising, that they would repeat as donors, particularly small donors, and that was building out the small donor base. And it was a huge win for us. I think I got an award for it, at a national committee event. But it started to put us on the map, and people started to take notice.
So what was your first election cycle as executive director? Was that 86?
It was 86.
Okay.
But we spent, what I became convinced of was the only way we could be relevant in 86. And I had this, I would have, when I came back to the state party, the job that I really wanted was I wanted to run the Mattingly campaign. I wanted to be the campaign manager for Mattingly, but that was a closed shop. There was no opportunity there. I went to Washington. I tried to talk.
Tried that.
Yeah. I went and talked to the Mattingly folks. I said, I want to take all I've learned at the RNC and the Bell campaign and so forth and help you guys. And it just wasn't happening. So shortly after I became state party director, Bob decided not to run for re-election as party chairman, and Coverdale ran. And that was a huge turning point for me professionally, although I didn't understand it as well then as I do now. Because Coverdale, at heart was an operative and a strategist, and he could see the big picture, and he knew it was coming along. He had great contacts at the national level because he'd been involved with then Vice President George Bush. He'd been his chairman here when Bush ran for president the first time. So Coverdale and I didn't know each other, but quickly developed a trusting relationship of chairman and operative, and Coverdale loved the issues piece of it the same way Bob Bell did. Of course, he was in the state Senate as Bob had been. So Coverdale, at the same time he was chairman of the party, he was also the minority leader in the state Senate.
Right.
And he was trying to kind of keep a wall up between that, and he had future statewide ambitions. So he pretty much gave me carte blanche as long as we were raising money and that kind of thing. He put the emphasis that needed to be put on fundraising. And I picked up on that, so we organized the staff in such a way that for the entire time of 1985, getting ready for the 86 elections, everybody on the staff had some job related to fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
And we rationalized that the only way we were going to be relevant was to have money to spend in 86, which we'd never had
Right.
as a candidate. And the only way we were going to gain the trust of the Mattingly people, which Coverdale and I were always constantly working at, was to have money. If we had money, we were relevant, and we could. If they saw that we were going to spend money, then they would pay attention to us, and they would help us.
So 1986, what sort of agreement, plan, strategy was there to stay out of the governor's race that year?
You know, it was never
Scheme, whatever it's called.
It was very frustrating for both Coverdale and me, because we were never party to that. You know,
okay.
It was
Okay.
a Mattingly campaign, speaking to Tom Perdue and talking people out of the race and that kind of thing, because
Okay.
they believed that if all the focus was on Mattingly, that they'd be victorious. Coverdale and I did not believe that. We believed that a stronger ballot would help turnout. Turnout was going to be an issue in a non-presidential year. Mattingly had won in a presidential year. We were plowing new ground, trying to re-elect a United States senator. So we wanted candidates up and down the line. We wanted legislative candidates. We wanted statewide candidates. But it met with resistance from a lot of the Mattingly folks, particularly the operatives. Robert Atchison and the campaign chairman over there, a guy named Dr. Lloyd Darby, those folks over there. Even some of the folks that were longtime folks in the party, they wanted all the focus to be on Mattingly because we had to win that race. And of course, my attitude was, well, yeah, we got to win that race, but what if we don't and we've lost the opportunity for everything else?
So there was a sense even early on in 85, 86 that this was too clever by half. That
Oh, way. And Pat Swindle was great about me. He
because that was his first reelect.
Right,
86.
it was his first reelect, and he saw that all the emphasis was going to Mattingly too, and so he wanted to win, but he also wanted to help, and he tried, but the problem was we were boxed in, by a lot of the Mattingly campaign efforts.
So what it seems like you're saying is there wasn't a whole lot of coordination between the state party and the Mattingly campaign or the RSCC.
There was.
There
but
was.
But it was. There was a lot of coordination.
Okay.
They were just very intent on any coordination had to benefit them and only them.
I see. So in 86, if I'm remembering correctly, Senator Mattingly loses narrowly.
Very narrowly.
Guy Davis, who jumped in the race at the very last second, performed as well as most people expected. Yeah. Was he closed out from party resources, as he later claimed?
Well, I mean, yes, he was, because he was not a legitimate candidate. He wanted the party to support an effort that he was part of that was not well funded, that was not well organized, that had no strategy, that had no message. And he wanted to blame all of his inadequacies on the state party organization. And he did so on the front page of the paper the week before the election, which just infuriated both me and Coverdale. We tried to be respectful of that, but it was, we'd created our own mess there. We should have had a better candidate from the outset.
So we've covered why Guy Davis lost. Why was Wyche Fowler able to oust Mattingly?
We handed it to him.
How
we
so?
We absolutely handed it to him. The message, they had a very good message in the attack ads early on about some of the votes that Wyche missed. Yes. And it was a very compelling argument, but they didn't finish the argument. And Coverdale and Gingrich and I distinctly remember a Sunday afternoon meeting at Coverdale's office, and Gingrich had just come from a Falcons game where the Falcons had lost, and he said, watching the Mattingly campaign is like watching the Falcons on offense. He said, it's just frustrating. And so we all tried to get Mattingly to pivot the message, not from the votes that Weich had missed to, and here are the votes that he made, and drive that wedge. And they never did. And Mattingly was and is a great guy. And just, it was so frustrating because having been a party chairman, I think he truly, cared about the party. And he obviously did to offer himself as a candidate for the Senate in 1980. But he just wasn't very well equipped, for that race, and he was very poorly staffed. The national campaign, I remember getting calls from Mitch Daniels and Haley Barbour, who were both working for Reagan then. What can we do? Mitch particularly, because he had an affinity for Mattingly because of the Indiana connection. And they just like, what can we do? What can we do? And so people would talk with him, but they were really hard-headed. He had some campaign advisors who, frankly, I don't think they ever did another campaign after that. But it was a message issue, and it was very unfortunate because the morning after the election, Mattingly gave a news conference, and he talked about what it had meant to him to be a United States Senator. And I was standing there listening to him, and I turned, my parents were there with me, and I turned to my dad and I said, we never heard this guy during the
Day
campaign.
late, dollar short.
This is what he should have been saying to the people of Georgia, but what it meant and what he tried to do, and it was just very frustrating.
As I recall, he spent, I don't know how much money he spent, but a considerable amount of time reaching out and advertising in black radio in Atlanta, trying to maintain that support he had in 1980.
Yeah, there was a false assumption made there that could work, and part of it was based on what Thad Cochran had successfully done in Mississippi the cycle before that.
Right.
Thad had a very cool kind of hip campaign in the black community. I remember the theme of it was his name is Thad, and it sounded like it was just a sort of a hip hop beat.
When I think of Thad Cochran, I think of hip and cool.
Oh yeah, exactly. It was totally not that. But Mattingly had that same kind of personality. But so they took a lesson of that and tried to apply it in Georgia, and it was just it was poorly conceived.
So 1986 turns into 1987, and Paul Coverdell steps down.
Paul knew that Bush was going to run for president,
right?
And he wanted to be involved in that.
Okay.
And had plans to be involved in it from the very beginning. So some of those plans were, set in motion even before the '86 elections were over. Bush had the first forerunner to a super PAC. It was called the Fund for America's Future, and Paul helped raise money for it in Georgia. Was involved in it. Paul thought that being chairman of the party, helping deliver a Mattingly win, would put him in a great position to help the vice president. And it's true, it would have.
So the race for chairman that emerges, there's Guy Davis, who campaigned on the pledge to fire you first thing.
Yeah, yes, he did.
How did that feel to be to be a campaign issue?
I remember going to the Republican Party dinner in February, and I think we had Bob Dole in, and I remember I was dating a girl whose brother was a friend of mine, and when we left the event, she said, "You and I've got to talk." I was like, "About what?" She said, "All these people there." She says, "Why don't they like you?" It's like, because I did my job. But it really, honestly, I don't remember it being upsetting to me. I almost wore it as a badge of honor that these people, that we had brought the party into the modern era. We had taken the donor base from less than 3,000 to over 17,000. We had an enormous resource. We had true professional staff there. we had a communications plan, we had a finance plan, we had really, we had made it a real party organization. And I knew it was, time for me to move on. I wasn't going to be staying there, but I hadn't decided exactly, where I was going to pivot. I knew I wanted to be involved in presidential politics again. I had an interview with the Dole folks. I had talked to the Kemp folks. And the Bush people were actually the last people to come around. So it was unsettling, I guess, but maybe I was just arrogant enough at that point to know that I'm leaving you guys. I've done my time here. I'm moving on.
How much coordination did you have, or support did the Coverdell administration, so to speak, lend to Jon Stuckey when he was running for party chair in '87?
We gave it all to him.
Yeah.
I remember Jon coming over to my house, and and I'd laid it all out. Here's the different pieces of this. Bob was thinking about running in that, and
That's right.
that was difficult for Paul because Stuckey had been part of Coverdell's what he called his point operation.
His point men.
Yep, and Jon had successfully recruited a young lawyer in Newnan to run for the state senate who had won, Skin Edge, who was looking like a bright young star of the party, and certainly was. So Jon had a lot going for him. That was Newt's home area, so he had Newt support. But no, we were all in with Jon, and Jon was a really good candidate, and probably, and I think he actually had ambitions to run for office himself.
Well, he had come out of the RNC as well with
for
Bill Brock
when as a young man, and when Brock was chairman back then. But so he understood what we're trying to do. He'd been one of our congressional district chairs. So
he came out of the 6th.
Yeah,
the old
right.
6th.
The old 6th. That's correct.
Yeah, with Stuckey, Gingrich, Randy Evans, I think came out of the 6th.
Randy was Jon's chosen pick to succeed him.
Well, there we go.
He'd been our county chairman in Douglas County.
Okay, so Jon Stuckey does become. I don't recall '87 being a close race as much as '89 for the state chairman's race would have been.
'87 was it was. He won pretty decisively at the end.
Yeah. That sort of show of strength sort of belied a new movement.
To Stuckey's credit, I remember telling him, I said, did you tell people that you would fire me too? He's like, well, of course I did. And we laughed about it over a drink, So it was, we started planning my transition out almost immediately after he.
So when you transitioned with Cliff Lorick, I think came in.
He
right
was
after
not
you.
my pick.
Enough said. So let's move on to '88. An interesting year for Republicans in Georgia.
Absolutely.
So you are on board with the Bush campaign,
Right?
Still situated in Georgia, headquartered.
Yeah, I lived in
Georgia?
Atlanta,
Okay.
but the Southern Regional Office was in Jackson, Mississippi, because that's where my boss was.
Okay.
That's where Lanny was, and Georgia was seen as a great opportunity for the vice president.
Sure.
We had a lot of good folks on the ground here. We had up and down the line.
Who were some of the other Bush organization members here in Georgia?
Well, in addition to Cooper, who was Coverdell's pick to be state chairman for Bush, we had a really young, ambitious state representative named John Lupton, who later left the state, left the legislature. But we had a really active group. We had county chairs, and all the counties mattered. We had a lot of organizational support, far and away better than anything anybody else had. Probably the closest to us in Georgia was probably the Kemp folks with Rusty and some of those folks. But we campaigned hard, and then Robertson happened. Just came out of the blue, and what they couldn't win at the ballot box, they tried to take at the convention level.
We'll get to that one. You had been involved in the party since '82.
Right.
Where had these culturally conservative, socially conservative voters been? Did they have a political home? In Georgia politics, were these Joe Frank Harris? Joe Frank Harris was a very culturally conservative Democrat.
I think I don't think they were necessarily looking for a home. You know, I think that they're probably people that voted for Reagan and Joe Frank. You know, honestly, a lot of them probably voted for Mattingly because of the Reagan connection. But I'm not sure that a lot of them had been involved in party politics at all. Certainly, you know, some of the things that we saw, you know, in '87, you know, suggested to me they had not been.
So they may have been voters, but they weren't necessarily activists.
Exactly.
Or participating. Okay. So Pat Robertson, he's got the 700 Club. You know, that's obviously the big mobilizing, you know, mouthpiece for the campaign. What was the reaction when Pat Robertson jumps into the race?
It was
especially
kind of
with
like,
the vice president.
Okay, you know, it was there was. I don't know that anybody showed any real concern for it until, you know, when we got to the Iowa caucuses and the Iowa straw poll, and that shook some folks up. You know, when he comes out of there, and Bush finishes third. You know,
and this is in the Ames.
Straw Ames. Yeah, in '87, it was very impactful for me personally, because then all the focus turned to the straw poll that was in Florida a couple months later, and I was the only guy that the various factions in the Bush campaign could agree on to go down and run the straw poll. And I remember Lanny telling me, he says, "You got to move to Orlando." I was like, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You can keep your apartment or whatever, you know, in Atlanta," said, "but you need to be in Orlando, you know, permanently."
For a straw poll.
Yeah, so I did. Yeah, I remember being very well known at the Ramada in downtown Orlando. Ramada Renaissance, I think it was.
So did you win?
And yeah, we did. Jeb was.
I was going to say, Jeb was already there.
Jeb was the Secretary of Commerce at the time. That's when I first got to meet and got to know Jeb. And yeah, we won with 57, almost 58% of the vote in the straw poll down there against Dole, Kemp, Robertson, the whole crowd. And it was a great opportunity for me, primarily because I was talking to Jeb every day, because he was very involved and understood, you know, the importance of organization. But the folks at the top of the Bush campaign were not at all confident that we were going to be able to pull that off. So much so that they did not allow the vice president to stay on the ground in Orlando to hear the results. And in one of the more fun things that happened to me during that 2-year period was I got a call from Air Force Two as he was heading wherever he was going from Florida, because the vote had been announced by that time. And everything you've read and seen about the Bush family being gracious and appreciating your good staff work is true, because he called to thank us and to congratulate us. I remember being handed one of those brick phones.
Oh, yeah, the Zach Morris phone from Saved by the Bell. So you finally got to leave the Ramada. You got to check out, come back to Atlanta.
Yep. Almost immediately to start figuring out what we were going to do about Georgia.
Right. So the Iowa caucuses happen, New Hampshire. Was it Michigan where the Robertson campaign?
Yes.
Because tell me about Michigan.
Those were the two problem states, Michigan and Georgia, and it was a problem, but more so because of the party rules. And we were not able to, as a presidential campaign, we were not able to set our slate of delegates, the people that we wanted to be delegates to the convention. And for a party that was still as immature as Georgia's was at that time, being delegate to a national convention was, one of the few things that you could aspire to and hope to achieve as a Republican in Georgia. It was a big deal. and people that were elected officials or large county chairmen, those were the prizes they wanted. And for us as a campaign, we wanted to be able to reward the people that worked hard for us and so forth. And we won big in Georgia, at the on Super Tuesday.
Oh, sure.
But there was enough, but the conventions would then pick the delegates, and that's where the trouble began.
Was this as big a surprise as I've been led to believe through the manuscript records that, those it would have been the counties, with fewer than 80,000 people, no, greater than 80,000 people, right, where Cobb County, Chatham County, Bibb County, that there are just people showing up out of the woodwork. Was it as big a surprise to the organization, to the state party?
Yes. We were, and Stuckey was chairman of the party, and he didn't take it seriously. Everybody thought, this is just going to be, a little noise here. And we started paying the price. And as I wasn't involved in running the state party at that time, but as the Bush guy, the most, aside from Coverdale and Cooper, I was the guy that supposedly knew the most about Georgia in the Bush world, and we had to bring command focus on it.
So let's see, because there's the precinct, and then
precinct.
County. I guess county was the first time where it really.
Yep.
That. So one of the major charges by the Robertson folks, Brandt Frost the fourth, to be clear on which Brandt Frost we're talking about, was that there was collusion between the state party and the Bush folks to close out these insurgents. Is that true?
Yeah, there was. Sure there was. Yeah. I mean, these were people that had never done anything to the Republican Party in Georgia, and they were hell-bent on destroying it, if that's what it took to get control. And they were not people that had worked in anybody's campaign except Pat Robertson's. Brandt Frost had never done anything for anybody until Pat Robertson came along. So the idea that they should, own all of that, was very controversial, and it was something that we'd never had to deal with, as the party regulars.
Along the way, from those county conventions, district conventions, I'm not sure when abouts with the state convention, but they actually picked up, so I get at least verbal, moral support from folks like Carl Gillis.
Oh yeah.
Carolyn Meadows, people who had been very active in the original Reaganites from 76, 1980. Maybe even some who had been involved in Goldwater's campaign, that they sort of saw themselves as kindred spirits.
The two people you just named, the way that they got to, the way you, at that point in time, the rules for electing the national committee man and committee woman were that the delegates to the national convention selected the national committee man and committee woman. So they saw the handwriting on the wall, and they didn't want to, particularly with Gillis and with Carolyn, they saw an opportunity to jump on the bandwagon. And they didn't like Bush, so it was easy. For them. They never liked Bush.
They had opposed Bush back in.
They didn't like Coverdale. They didn't trust Cooper, and so there was already enough tension there to.
So the factionalism within the party shouldn't be seen as necessarily the Christian right versus the regulars, but the regulars were already split among the Coverdale, Cooper,
because
versus others.
The folks that had come up in the party with Reagan and were Reagan supporters, whatever, they didn't trust Bush.
Okay.
And so they didn't. And remember, this was the only thing that you could fight over in those days. There was not. We didn't control anything. Maybe a county commission, here or there, and Cobb.
I think Cobb switched in '86.
Yeah. Somewhere along there.
Sounds right.
But so these were the things people fought over in order to be relevant, and to be leaders.
The old mountain out of a molehill kind of.
Exactly.
Speaking of mountains out of a molehill, the state convention in Albany was an unmitigated PR disaster.
Yes, it was.
Did you see that coming? Did you know that it was going to be as bad as it was?
Yep. We had calls about it. We, as a Bush team, my job at that was to try to keep the damage as contained as we could, and
mitigate
we know
losses.
this is going to be bad, and at that point, Stuckey was feeling really embattled, and he was not feeling like he had support that he needed and so forth. Of course he did, and he was in a blame mode. He wanted to blame Coverdale, he wanted to blame Cooper, he wanted to blame me, and others like us, and it was a mess.
So you attended the
Oh
convention.
yeah, I was there. I watched the gavel fly.
So he did break the gavel. Actually broke.
It flew. He hit it so hard he lost his grip on it, and it went flying out into the audience.
So tell me about the convention from your perspective that day of what was actually happening on the floor and outside, where apparently there was much action.
There was a convention, then there was a rump convention.
Right.
And I'll never understand what I'll always believe that there was collusion between the state Democrats at the time and the mayor of Albany that day, because after the convention was over with, we turned to the people that ran the convention hall and said, "Shut it down. It's over. We hold the lease with you. Shut it down." They didn't not only shut it down, they turned the lights back on for them. They got microphones on for them so that they could have the rump convention. Bobby Kahn and the boys, of course, understood the impact that was going to have, on us going into '88.
Was it premeditated on the state party's part to close the convention and select delegates with the state central committee?
I don't know that it was,
or was that post the court ruling?
We knew the rules. I mean, we knew we could muddle through, but I don't think anybody realized how boisterous the Robertson folks could and would become, and Brandt was loving it. I mean, it was like he was the high school quarterback taking his team to the state championship.
So as I alluded to, the state party reconvenes state central committee, as the rules stated that they could do, which was announced that was the 14 at-large delegates. The rump convention had named their 14 delegates, wisely selecting the people, and everybody goes off to New Orleans. And once again, Georgia sends 2 slates of Republicans. That's a great Republican tradition in Georgia, dating back to the 40s, 50s.
Right.
Very normal. What happened? How was that reconciled? How was the conflict concluded there?
There was a decision made among folks that had no interest in Georgia except to settle this and sweep it under the rug. Edie Holliday, the counsel for the campaign, Rich Bond, who was the deputy campaign manager in name, their decision was to just settle this, and not. They didn't want a problem on the floor. They didn't want Pat Robertson being upset. So they settled it, but they didn't do the math right. And in not doing the math right, they basically turned over control of the delegation to the Robertson folks.
So the agreement that Coverdale was working on, the unfortunately named 666 plan, dividing up the control, the Bush campaign would have been happy splitting the control, but instead they offered up enough power to name the national committeeman and national committeewoman.
Right.
What was the fallout from that, from your perspective in the state party?
It was devastating to folks that had worked very hard for Bush, because we felt like that the and I was right in the middle of it because I was the former state director of the party, but I was working for Bush, so I had to go out and defend what my bosses had done, which was very difficult, particularly when friends of mine were denied their seats as delegates. They had traveled New Orleans and were denied access to the floor, through the action, that was coordinated through the Republican National Committee by Rich Bond. So it was very personal, and it was one of the in what should have been a very joyous, happy, celebratory time for a lot of people. To this day, I don't go back to New Orleans, and I don't think about it.
The campaign afterward, the general action campaign, Dukakis, you guys were very successful.
Oh yeah.
What do you think the long-term impact of, actually the short-term impact of the Christian right sort of incorporating themselves within the Republican Party? Was it clear that they were there to stay in 1988?
It was clear to me they were there to stay. There was no question in my mind that things had changed, and that candidates were going to see opportunities in a very active, group of people, and very. They tasted a little bit of politics, and my experience is that, and had been through party politics in Georgia, is that people that get exposed to party politics or exposed to a candidate for the first time, then they do get involved in party politics because they want some ownership of that, and they feel some ownership of it, and that was I could see it happening.
What was your role after the '88 campaign? Did you come back to Georgia?
I did not. I went to Atwater. Convinced me. I really wanted to work at the White House. Atwater convinced me that because he was going to be chairman of the party, that all the politics was going to happen at the RNC. And so I went to the RNC as the deputy political director, and moved to D.C.
Finally got to D.C.?
Finally got to move to D.C. and took up residence there. And I was, but already, even at the end of '88, people were looking towards 1990 in Georgia, because it was going to be an open governor's race. Everybody knew that Zell was going to run governor, so that meant the lieutenant governor's race was going to be open, and so there'd be a lot of opportunities. And then reapportionment was going to follow, after that. So there were a lot of interest, and I had developed a great relationship with Johnny Isakson, through those years. Going back to when he almost ran for Congress in '86, when I was working at the party, and we'd stayed in touch, and Johnny's just great about that kind of stuff. And he was one of the people that came to New Orleans, not as a delegate, but trying to help people, trying to keep people together. I remember he threw a party in New Orleans for everybody. It was one of the few things that everybody came to, the Robertson Bush, because Johnny is that kind of personality. But I went to D.C., thinking, okay, this is going to be good. The national party, and I was back at the RNC. And Atwater, he was the coolest of the cool at that time.
Oh yeah,
and you
bad
working
boy.
for Lee Atwater, you were thought to be at the top of your game.
When did he get sick?
He got.
That was
I
after
left.
90?
Isakson started talking to me about running for governor and said, asked me to run the campaign. I said, no, I can't do it. I've made a commitment to Atwater to stay here for 2 years, but I'll help you find somebody. So I would send him candidates. He kept coming back saying, no, this just didn't quite right. So unbeknownst to me, one day, I knew he had an appointment with Atwater, just to come. He came to D.C., came to see Newt, to ask for Newt's blessings for his campaign for governor. And he'd already announced, he was already raising money, and he did have a meeting with Atwater, but I wasn't involved in the meeting until the end of the meeting. Atwater called me up to his office and said, hey, I think you need to go run this campaign. I was like, what? I said, I committed. He says, Johnny was just in here and asked me to let you go to Georgia and run the campaign. He said, I've always been frustrated by Georgia and that it hadn't matured as a party as South Carolina had. said, I think you ought to go do it. And I was like, really? And he's like, yep. He says, I think you need to do this. And I said, but I committed to this, and I committed to you, and I never will forget that conversation, because he said, listen, Bush is going to get reelected in '92. He said, we'll lose in '96. He said, and he loved to talk about the millennial. He says, we'll all get back together for the millennial in 2000 and take it back. Well, the background on that is that Atwater was totally opposed to Dan Quayle being picked as the running mate in '88. Was surprised by it. I remember the briefing we took in New Orleans with all the Robertson mess going on, when Quayle was named. Atwater was totally opposed to it. So he never had any faith that Dan Quayle could.
Was that purely a sop to the culturally conservative?
Quayle?
Yeah.
No, I think it was Bob Teeter just
Bob
being
Teeter,
too
there's
cute
a
by
name.
half. I mean, Teeter had been Quayle's pollster, and Teeter had this, crazy poll he came up with that said that Quayle did well with women, and that it would help, Bush. And remember now, Bush was, we were on the ropes, going into the convention.
Oh, sure.
It was by no means a foregone conclusion, and so they had this crazy notion that Quayle helped them with women, and it was, and Atwater wanted Bush to do what Reagan had done. He wanted him to ask, one of the Doles, either Bob or Elizabeth, be on the ticket, because he had polling that showed that the strongest ticket was Bush Dole, whether it be Bob or Elizabeth. And it was totally rejected by the Bush family, and because they just did not like Bob Dole.
1980 was a little rough.
Yeah.
Well, 88 was. Stop lying about my record.
So Atwater lays out this whole scenario, and he says, "Listen, go down there. He says, I will support you 100%. Said, we'll get you good votes. We'll get cabinet people in there. Said, we'll support Johnny in the primary." And he was true to that. I mean, he sent Carroll Campbell in to endorse Johnny, before the primary, as the governor of South Carolina coming across, and Carroll Campbell was a rock star, then. And he was Atwater's guy. He was who Atwater was talking about when he said, we'll get back together in 2000. He'd elected a sitting vice president to be president. His last act, in his mind, was going to be to elect his best friend to be president of the United States. And that was Carroll Campbell.
So you leave. I
leave.
hope you didn't sign a long-term lease in D.C.
No.
So you come back, and there's not much of a primary.
Not really.
Bob Wood
we gave
maybe one more.
a real head fake to Israel early on. I helped Johnny think about that. We raised $200,000 in Cobb County before I joined the campaign. I said, like, Johnny, do a big event. And at that time, if you got a letter of credit for the campaign, it was considered a contribution. You could show it on the books. So that convinced Johnny to go get a letter of credit for another $200,000, put it there. So and Israel was totally spooked by it, and he ended up not running.
So it was you and Johnny who the George Israel boomlet that never developed.
And the cool thing about that was we had all these Democrat candidates running.
Oh yeah.
And there would be these forums all over the state, and all the Democrats and Johnny.
So he attended.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. I wasn't.
I
I was unsure that it wasn't. They weren't separate events.
He was popular with a lot of those organizations.
Okay.
They were sponsoring him because they had seen him in the legislature. He'd been on the commission that Joe Frank had. There was some commission about Georgia's future or whatever. So he traveled around and gotten to know some of those folks too. And as the minority leader in the state house, he'd gotten a lot of good exposure.
And he was very much out of the cooperative mold.
Oh yeah.
If there's a definition of go along, get along, is that fair?
I don't think that's fair. I think what's fair is that Isakson, knew that a lot of the solutions to challenges facing Georgia were neither Republican or Democrat, but they relied a lot on a strong economic development model in Georgia, and he was, whether it was taxes or size of government or how government operates, whatever. It was focused on what this does to the potential for growth. And
Okay.
he'd seen that in his
Okay.
home county.
Oh,
He'd
sure.
seen that in his own business. I mean, here was the guy that was the godfather of suburban
East Cobb.
residential development. President of the largest independent real estate firm in the South, and so he'd seen it firsthand of these people moving here. He'd participated in what didn't become a great deal, but was a big deal at the time with RJR coming to Cobb County. So I mean, he knew that stuff, and he made himself a resource to the Democrat administrations that there.
So, what was the campaign strategy, assuming that the primary was going to be cleared, as it was, token opposition from a couple fellows? It was assumed that Zell Miller was going to come out of the.
Not always. I mean, there was a point in time where
Was
we
it
thought
Andy
Andy
Young?
could have pulled it off. Remember, the lottery was tested,
Right.
in terms of the polling, and Zell. I mean, Zell was a one, he was a one-note song on that, or one-trick pony, as they say, and he drove it hard, he basically remade himself, through that issue as a statewide candidate. He had a lot of good support, a lot of folks behind him, but part of our campaign strategy was predicated on Zell getting a little bit more beat up than he did. The lottery really protected him in a lot of ways from his negatives being driven up in that primary, and that was a disappointment to us. That and Johnny's longtime friend Pierre Howard was running for lieutenant governor. Sam Nunn was running for re-election, but he basically was unchecked because there was no real opposition to him. So the Democrats had this great ticket, of Nunn, Miller, Howard, and I could see the train coming, and I was like, this is we got to help. But I went back to Atwater and the folks up there and said, we got to have your help. Well, Lee had gotten sick by that time, and so Atwater was not in a position to help us, and unfortunately, the guy that was running Zell's campaign, James Carville, was quietly dating Mary Madeline, who was the chief of staff at the RNC at the time. And I knew it, but I was trying to maneuver around it. The RNC had promised us $100,000, which was big money in those days. I was having a hard time getting it. They would. But I used some of my connections from the Bush campaign to get up to D.C. I remember we staged a media event the day of the Democrat runoff, where Johnny would be in the Oval Office with Bush, getting the president's endorsement for his campaign. First time, sitting United States president had endorsed, a Republican candidate for governor. So we're trying to build this feeling. But the same day that we did that, the Democrats knew it was coming. And they announced, this is our dream ticket, Nunn, Miller, Howard, and it was strong, and it was. I mean, they knew that they had a tighter race on their hands than they would admit, particularly with Isakson, as the guy.
What was it like squaring off against Carville and Begala?
Oh, it was, it was one of those. Great experiences you never forget because they were so good. I mean, message-wise, nobody beats Begala. Carville got a lot of the credit for that win, but Begala was really the guy. He was the guy training Zell. Begala and Bill Stevens, who later became Zell's press secretary, they were the guys that would get Zell in a room before the event and just drill him on that. Zell still had a temper then, and we were trying to we were trying to find a way to get him to blow up, and to show the old Zell versus this. And we didn't quite have the resources we needed. We came up with an idea on the lottery. Okay, so if this is that popular, then Johnny took the position, okay, if a lottery ticket is, sold in Fulton County, that money stays in Fulton County for those schools. And it caught on a little bit, and the numbers tightened up. The polling showed us doing pretty good. Well, they just doubled down, and then they attacked Johnny on not supporting the lottery, and he wasn't in front of this, so they had to drive that wedge, and it opened back up a little bit. But and they attacked Johnny on some of his dad's past and some of that stuff, and that got to be, it was very personal and very
That was at the
offensive.
debate.
It was in a debate, and we were ready for it. We knew it was coming, and we had a line ready for Johnny that he couldn't quite deliver that night because it was so emotional with him. But we rehearsed it. I distinctly remember it, where Johnny was supposed to, when Zell, made his remark as he did that night about Johnny's dad, Johnny was supposed to step away from the podium and look at Zell and say, Zell, if you were half the man my daddy is, I wouldn't be in this race. And we knew that it would be one of those TV moments, the race, and Johnny couldn't quite get the line out because the tie with him and his dad was so tight, so much so he couldn't quite get it out, and his voice broke. Well, Bill Stevens, as soon as the debate's over, said, we made Johnny cry. And so and Johnny was so mad. I remember we went to a bar right after the debate because the debate was at the Temple. And we went up the street at a bar, and Johnny thought he had done better than he had. He said to me, I kicked his ass. He says, I really felt it up there. Remember, Johnny was 45.
Yeah,
he was in the prime of his career. And I was like, Johnny, it didn't come off that well. He said it didn't. He said it didn't. I said, it didn't come off the way you wanted it to. And he said, but the interesting thing was the media kind of turned on Zell after that for bullying Johnny, and we got a little bit of a bump in it. It wasn't enough, and we didn't have the resources. We needed another $500,000 in media to make it really tight, and that, which sounds like chump change now, but then it was big money.
Right. You wrote a postmortem after the election, and you talked about South Georgia. South Georgia had been a real focus for the Isakson campaign, either opening headquarters. One of the big points was you were opening headquarters in Middle and South Georgia, where Republicans just didn't play.
Yep.
Later on in the postmortem, you called it a pipe dream that you were actually trying to carry. Was the theory that if you had more money, more time, you could have cut your losses enough in South Georgia and juiced the numbers in the donut? Yeah. And that would have was that the strategy?
It was. I mean, we thought, and it was a two-pronged strategy. One was that we could drive the numbers up in South Georgia. We could force Zell to spend more resources out there because we needed it to be as even a playing field as we could in media in Atlanta. Right. Because we knew that would, we still had that problem as a party in Georgia in 1990 of replicating presidential year turnouts. We weren't quite there, and that was also the premise of the postmortem, is that that the vote we didn't get, the same vote that Bush had gotten in '88 or Reagan in '84, just wasn't there in the suburbs.
There's some speculation in the press that it was Johnny's image of this slick suburban country club Republican that really hurt him. But as I recall, Zell Miller actually won in Gwinnett, and he may have won DeKalb that year.
Yeah, they had a real focus on that because they knew that was their firewall. That was their insurance policy. If they could do well in Gwinnett, cut into, they read the numbers too. I mean, the Carville and Bagala, Keith Mason. Keith knew those numbers backwards. Keith being a Gwinnett boy,
Wayne Mason's son.
Yeah, exactly. And Wayne was huge in that campaign, part of the Gwinnett Mafia. They were. That was kind of a point of pride with them. And
Virgil Williams as well.
Exactly. We want to do well in Gwinnett because that'll stem the Republican tide. Because they'd seen what had happened to them locally there.
Oh, sure.
In '86 and '88, and what they expected to happen in '90.
And how much of an impact did having Pierre Howard as lieutenant governor help boost the numbers in DeKalb, which was at that time not
Pierre
as blue.
Pierre was extremely popular in his home county, great candidate, looked good, sounded good. He was a true compliment to Zell, that and did as much. It's probably one of the unwritten stories of that race, frankly, is how much Pierre's presence on that. Because if Pierre had lost, he would have lost to Joe Kennedy, who was, South Georgia, didn't look good on television, nice guy, but, wouldn't have set up the same kind of contrast.
The old Georgia
Yep.
versus the new
exactly.
Georgia. So Pierre Howard was able to tap into the North DeKalb neighborhoods that Johnny, by all rights, I mean, that's very, very similar, North DeKalb versus East Cobb. I mean, that's sort of the lifeblood of the Republican
Pierre
Party.
did well in Cobb County. Pierre,
That's true.
Yeah, he had he was well funded, had a good message. I mean, we had we didn't have we had no ballot strength. We got no help from anybody else on the ballot with us that year, except for, Newt.
Looking at the election returns, Johnny performed well where you expected him to perform well in Metro Atlanta, some of the Columbia County, some of the outlying suburbs around the urban centers. He actually did pretty well down in Southwest Georgia. What's the explanation there?
We spent a lot of time down there. We had a great grassroots organization, and it was part of the legacy that Johnny left in that campaign that I believe personally is one of the reasons that Coverdale won in '92. Is that we really opened up from an organizational perspective, Johnny's contacts as being president of the Georgia Association of Realtors, as being a legislator, his fraternity, the University of Georgia network. I mean, all that kind of came together, particularly in South Georgia, that campaign, as well as over in the Augusta area, Chatham County, that area. We got a lot of people involved for the first time that really thought there was an opportunity for a Republican to win statewide.
And that's also where Alec Poitevin was from, the second
Poitevin,
district, who was chairman.
Remember, Poitevin was exactly, but one of our county chairmen, who was our county chairman in Colquitt and Moultrie, in 1990, Saxby Chambliss. So there were a lot of people that came into politics in 1990 that stayed.
Okay. So as you mentioned, you've already mentioned Coverdale, 92. What role did you play in the 92 campaign?
I was asked to run the campaign. I turned them down. I didn't feel like that the Coverdales and the Fred Coopers of the world did as much as they could to help Johnny. We were all hurt by that loss. We thought that they were already looking past 90 to 92 when Coverdale planned to run. And I remember being summoned to Cooper's house, sitting in front of the fire. I'd just gotten married, and him saying, "We would like to invite you to, be part of the Coverdale organization, and we'd like for you to be, the campaign manager." And I was just really, I was offended that Coverdale would send Cooper to ask me. Coverdale and I had a great relationship. He was chairman. I had tremendous respect for him. And I was like, why isn't Paul asking me? Well, he was still at the Peace Corps, and we're trying to, do this on the up and up and that kind of thing. But it just didn't feel right. And they thought that there was a chance Johnny might run. And the National Committee wanted Johnny to run. Phil Graham came to Georgia multiple times and met with Johnny and asked him to run. And I wanted Johnny to run. I was, pushing that. So I also felt like that, they didn't want me in the effort as much as they didn't want Johnny to have, and there was no way I'd do that. My loyalty to Johnny was, was and is stronger than that. So, I started consulting. I decided, okay, I got to make a living, figure this out while I'm figuring this out. And because of Johnny's success, there were a lot of people that were looking at, congressional races and legislative races and reapportionment, that kind of thing. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I, try this? So I started consulting with folks and picked up some good clients in Georgia and one particularly good client in Florida. You know, that Tilly Fowler, whose dad had been a long time state senator here. And I was still holding out hope that, you know, Johnny would, you know, run. And I tried to encourage him as much as I could. And the Coverdale people, of course, figured that out. And that kind of created a little bit of tension there until Johnny finally decided he wasn't going to do it.
You worked for Matt Collins?
I did.
So you managed a successful campaign in '92, and you had mentioned reapportionment in 1990, and that had been in the works in the RNC with the 1991 plan. The '91 plan was a long time coming.
Yep.
How was it implemented in Georgia? What level of coordination had there been with RNC, state party?
There was a plan at the national level, but in Georgia, it was the law of unintended consequences. You know, Speaker Murphy's disdain, lack of respect, and true hatred of the Republican Party, you know, became such a focus of his, and punishing Newt, you know, and being too cute by half, as Johnny likes to say, you know, set us up. I mean, they so set us up. They did a better job of setting us up than we could have with any, you know, cadre of attorneys and, you know, money and whatever. I mean, you know, we spent next to nothing here, and they gave us a map where we could win 6 seats. You know, we just didn't have the candidates, you know, in '92. And then we did go on, you know, in '94 to pick up some of those seats. But it was total, they created it, you know, in their own arrogance about, you know, what they could do with votes, and you know, they set us up.
So basically by moving Newt from the 3rd to the 6th district, opened up the 3rd for Matt Collins.
What they hoped was going to happen on that was they were trying to box Newt out. They were hoping that they'd create a district there that Johnny would want.
Oh, okay.
And they talked to him about it. Pierre Howard, you know, will tell you, you know, that they talked to Johnny about it. And they were going to box Newt because Newt had another tough battle in '90, tougher than he thought it was going to be. And he desperately wanted to move. So he had his emissary, you know, running back and forth to Cobb County. They came to me, you know, they hired me as a consultant, you know, trying to, you know, bridge that as well, trying to make inroads into the Isakson organization. And so they knew Newt wanted a better district, and but he had no leverage to create on his own.
Right.
So as soon as and by putting the 6 on it, you know, it was Newt's, you know, 6th district. It was, that part of the plan was ingenious. It was the rest of it that, you know, wasn't very well thought out.
Was it true that, or is it true that Pierre Howard drew a legislative district specifically for Johnny Isakson?
Yeah, it's true.
It is true.
Yeah.
Is that something that he wanted to get back into the legislature?
Well, he was trying to ease his guilty conscience of, you know.
Oh, Pierre Howard's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He was trying to, you know, I mean, because he and Johnny were fraternity brothers and good friends, and, you know, I think Pierre was uncomfortable with a lot of things that were said about Johnny during the '90 campaign, and this was kind of a way to get him back in the game.
So after Matt Collins wins, you actually go back up to Washington.
Yeah. I still had this, that I thought being chief of staff to a United States Congressman, a United States Senator, was one of the coolest jobs around. And in my time as an intern for Jack Brinkley, who was my home district congressman, you know, years before that, I still wanted to go back. I had this, you know, interest in it, and the tradition of that, the history of that, of different people that have held those jobs. You know, my mentor, Rogers Wade, being Talmadge's chief of staff, I just had this vision of what that job was, and what, and the different people in Georgia that had it. And so I really wanted to do that. And I didn't think I wanted to do it necessarily. Thought maybe time had passed me by, because at this point my wife and I had our first child, and I really didn't think that was in the cards. But when Mac won, the wheels started turning, and it was a big surprise. Nobody thought Mac was going to win. So the morning after the election, I'm sitting with Mac in our campaign office, which was about the size of this room here, and had no furniture, had a piece of plywood on top of a couple of file cabinets, and that was the campaign desk. And so Collins was like, "Now what? Tell me what I got to do." I said, "Well, you got to get a staff." And he said, "Well, will you help me, put together a staff?" I said, "Well, yeah, I can." I said, "But I'm not sure that would be very fair to whoever you choose to be chief of staff." And I never forget him saying, "Well, I was kind of hoping you'd take that job for yourself." That's the way he hired me. And I went home and told my wife, and she was like, "Can we talk about this?"
This sounds familiar.
But she was great about it. We moved up, and it was a great experience, because Mac was a terrific boss, and appreciated good staff work. And it was such a surprise to folks that he won the seat. We still hold the record for the least amount of money spent turning out an incumbent. We spent less than $200,000 on that race.
In '92, who was over there?
Richard Ray.
Ah. So that was part of the Matt Collins, Jack Kingston,
John
Linder. And
Yep.
and what you're saying is in '94, had those candidates, although Saxby ran and almost
Saxby ran and lost the primary
right
in '92.
to
Yep.
a more right of center
Yep.
candidate. Had those candidates been in place, the Bob Barrs, the Saxby Chambliss, the Charlie Norwoods,
Yep.
that would have happened in '92 just as
I think
easily.
so. Yeah. But going back, we in '84 and '85, when I was working at the RNC, Haley had come in and working with a guy who he'd known from the Connolly campaign. We had this project called Operation Breakthrough.
Oh,
And the idea was to get people to run for the legislature, to create a farm team so that we'd have good candidates for Congress, 5, 6, 10 years down the road.
this was the Nolan Murrah's Operation Breakthrough?
Exactly. And we totally adopted that when I was state party director. And GOPAC helped us with that. And some of the people that were, Kingston was an early recruit in that. Linder was already in the state house, but was part of that strategy. Frank Albert, who was recruited to run and won a state senate over in Augusta, was also, we thought would be the guy that would, be able to take that seat over there. And he didn't take it, but Charlie did. Norwood was the same kind of, candidate. But.
So Operation Breakthrough, I'm glad you brought it up, because we sort of bypassed recruitment and targeting when we were talking about this. Operation Breakthrough was a separate PAC. Was it separate from the? It was separate from the party.
It wasn't a separate PAC. It was a national fundraising effort led
Okay.
by GOPAC, which Newt eventually got involved in. But it was Pete DuPont.
Newt and Bo Calloway. Bo Calloway was
Newt,
later.
Bo Calloway, Pete DuPont.
Okay.
Pete DuPont started GOPAC. And then Newt and Calloway took it over. And I convinced them to spend money in Georgia. And basically they would give the state party money, but we had to give them a plan ahead of time about how we'd use it. And it involved the direct mail, using phone banks, et cetera, to bolster targeted legislative races. And I got them to add a county commission race to that in '86, which is when Chuck Clay won. He was the first guy to win on the west side of Cobb County as county commission candidate. And then he ran for the state senate, later became Republican leader.
Right.
But that was the idea, was you go out and find candidates that you could see would have this would set them on a path. Skin was one of those.
Right. What were the tools available to you or the party members to convince these people, other than a really nice pitch? What were the tools where it's like you to convince these people, these candidates, potential candidates, they could actually run and win?
Well, we created the first algebraic targeting system that had been used in Georgia. I had seen it in Texas when I worked for the RNC. They called it Orvis. And so we did this extensive vote analysis that showed people these are the precincts you got to target. These are the parts of these districts you got to target. And we could show them, a mathematical model that said you can win if you do these things and work on that. And if you'll run and if you'll buy into this, we'll pay for mail, we'll pay for phone banks, we'll pay for some of this. And we had real money to do that with. So the short answer to your question is we could offer money. We'd never been able to do that as a state party before.
So 92, to jump back ahead.
Right.
You leave knowing there's going to be a Republican majority.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you do that?
Because I had worked for Newt. I'd seen the movie. I knew how it was going to end. I never believed that he was going to be a long-termer. I knew that his personal management style and his politics were going to be his undoing.
What do you mean by that?
Newt is he's a brilliant guy. Just his ideas and the way he thinks about issues is still unique. There still is not a politician, on the scene that has the ability to look at issues and message issues the way he does. But he's just incredibly undisciplined, and I think that I think he's in a different place today than he was then, but it was just really clear to me that this was going to be, that the majority under his leadership. I told friends of mine who looked at me like I was crazy when I was leaving. I was like, I'm not, tying myself to this star. I mean, it's not. I just don't see it. And at the Hill, while it was exciting and great, I could see that wasn't where I wanted to spend my career. I wanted more control of my own. I just knew it was time for me to do something different. I had 2 kids at this point, and I was thinking about where I want to raise them and what we want to do. And I didn't want to raise them in D.C.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want them to come up thinking that culture is normal. And so we came home. I had a great opportunity with a guy who'd been my mentor and a great advisor for many years.
You want me to pause?
Mm-hmm.
So you're back in Georgia, consulting again.
Right.
What was it like working, the Gold Dome in the 1990s, early 90s?
Well, you go back to my impressions of all of it. When I was state director of the party, my dad had been president of the Georgia Women's Association, chairman of the board.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd gotten some good press about what we were going to do at the state party. So I get called down to the Capitol one day by the lobbyist for the Women's Association to meet with the chairman of the Rules Committee, who at that time was Bill Lee from Clayton County. And the whole point of it was to try and convince me that I should be working for the Republican Party. So that was the backdrop, that those people, and some of those people were still there. So come back to Georgia, and we really thought that in 94, 96, we were going to make a bigger move than we did. But coming back to the Capitol, particularly working with Rogers and that firm, having people were starting to understand and starting to have when I say people, I mean corporations, starting to understand that they needed more than one lobbyist. And Florida had kind of been the trailblazer on that, where, okay, you got these Republicans that their numbers are growing. We better have somebody on our team that can talk to them. And there were two of us that could. It was me and Skin. And we were the only, Casey Cagle will tell you that when he got elected to the state Senate, there were two Republican lobbyists at the Capitol. It's me and Skin. And so we became the beneficiary of that thinking that there needed to be. Skin had served there. I knew a lot of people that were serving there.
Was Skin still, was he with Georgia Link back then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He's always been with him.
Okay.
That's been his one thing. So, and it started, and of course, things started turning. 98, when Sonny was running, I guess 98, that was 98.
Mm-hmm.
That, a lot of people were still, I'm not sure he's the guy, they tried to get Johnny to run, this kind of thing, and it didn't happen. So, things started develop in a way that people thought, well, this may be a two-party state after all.
Would you have come back into the campaign world had Johnny run for governor in '94?
Yes. Yeah, he had. We talked about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I would have. I was doing in '96. I did some work for Pete Wilson.
Oh, wow.
Running for president. I didn't think Bob Dole was the guy, so I was still kind of half in, half out. And Rogers gave me some leeway to do that, which was nice. I was still working on some of the corporate clients, doing a lot of grassroots work and supporting issues, that kind of thing. Not a lot of lobbying because there wasn't as much of a call for it then. But I was the campaign part of it. I never wanted to go back, manage somebody's race necessarily, but the consulting part of it definitely appealed to me.
As somebody, you weren't in the campaign, but as somebody familiar with Johnny Isakson, familiar with Georgia politics, walk me through his '96 primary with Guy Milner. And what that meant for the Republican, or the direction of the Republican Party. Was that a turning point election for the direction of the party?
It should have been more of a turning point.
Okay.
If Milner had been true to his word and remained as Johnny's finance chairman, which was his commitment, we would have won that race. There's no question in my mind we would have won it. Johnny was the perfect candidate to follow on from Sam Nunn. It was kind of it was a perfect transition. He was perfect kind of Republican candidate to have at that time thing. And he was game for it. And he was a very energetic candidate. He was in the prime of his career with that. He had the resources. He had the time. We had a lot of people that were very supportive of that. It was not so far away from the '90 campaign that a lot of the organizational folks were there. A lot of folks that went from our campaign in '90 to Coverdale's in '92 were still out there and chomping at the bit, ready to go. But Milner just completely complicated it because he had run a close race for governor. He was respected for that, and it made it really tough.
In the '90s, the major sort of structural changes that really drive party growth, demographics and the Christian right.
Yep.
How did the Christian right go from 1988, sort of insurgents, to really fueling Guy Milner and candidates like that in the Republican primaries?
Well, I think that that in the middle there in '94, of course, you had the Republican take over the House. And so Gingrich was a dominant personality there, and his brand of politics and the sort of smash mouth, veer right kind of politics was not Isakson at all. And Johnny took some hits on that for not being tough enough and not being strident enough. But that just wasn't Johnny. It was not the appeal to him, and I think it's one of the reasons that he's he's been a good senator and would have been a good senator then, is because he's not of that ilk. But that was the thinking that you had to have guys. And we had people in our own delegation at that point, and by 95 leading into 96. I mean, Charlie Norwood, John Linder. Linder was on his way to becoming chairman of the congressional committee, and they didn't want candidates like Isakson. They wanted candidates that were more strident and more willing to take the contract with America and promote it. So we knew we had a problem there to our right, and we overcorrected. We made some real mistakes in that campaign. We tried to be nuanced on the abortion issue, and it was the worst political mistake I have participated in as an Isakson operative or an operative at all. That we made a terrible mistake on it. We shouldn't have tried to think that we could nuance that issue at all.
Like this is 96, sort of. Is that the one where there's the family ad with Johnny's wife and daughter?
Yep. We never should have put them in that position. It was a terrible mistake. We were angry. We were angry that Milner was in the race. We were angry that we had to explain that Isakson was a guy who had great family values, against a Milner, who had his own, challenges there. It is. We acted out of personal pique, and we gave Johnny bad advice, and I participated in that. I was part of that, and I regret it to this day. The mistake we made was, and the polling showed this. If we had taken the polling and then gone to focus groups with some of the messaging, which we later did, when Johnny won successfully, but experience was still a major point that was in Johnny's favor, and we did not harp on that enough.
That actually helped you back then.
Yeah. I mean, we could have beaten Milner on that if we had stuck to that and not gotten distracted by the abortion issue.
He was back. It was this state senate. Was Johnny in the state senate?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But he resigned to run for
Sure.
U.S. Senate. But he had been in the state senate, and they picked at him on a couple of votes there, as I recall. But if we'd focused more on the experience, particularly in succeeding Sam Nunn, then we would have been better off. We'd have been better off if we'd never run that ad.
So Johnny's unsuccessful in the primary, but very quickly the Republican Party starts picking up steam in the 1990s.
Well, and an important thing that I want to pass on there, I never will forget a couple of days after Johnny lost the primary to Milner. I was at OK Cafe in Buckhead, and sitting a couple tables over was Governor Miller and Michael Coles. I think he was the chairman of the party then.
The cookie magnate.
Governor Miller comes by the table and speaks and this kind of thing. So I get up to leave, and I'm at the register, and Governor Miller is standing there while Coles is paying the check, and he said, "I want to talk to you outside." I was like, "Yes, sir." So come outside, and he said, "Do you know how to contact Johnny?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." He said, "I want to talk to him." He says, "I've got a job for you." I said, "Sir?" He said, "I've got a job." He says, "Your job is to keep Johnny Isakson involved in politics." And I said, "I don't know about that, Governor." We were hurt. We were as hurt as we were after 90. 96 was awful because we felt like we had, in my mind, we'd let Johnny down, and the party had let Johnny down. And so I said that to Governor Miller. I said, I don't know that you can. He says, "No." He says, "I've got an idea." He says, "Get me a number for him." He says, "Call my secretary." So I knew where Johnny was. He was he had retreated to the mountains where they keep a house on the lake. And so I called down and gave the secretary the number. A couple of days later, I get a call from Johnny. He said, "Did you tell Zell how to reach me?" And I was like, "Yeah, I did." He said, "I told you I didn't want to talk to him about it." I said, "Just out of curiosity, what did he say?" He said, "He wants me to be on the state school board." I said, "Well, what'd you tell him?" Because already the wheels were turning. This might be the way back. And I told him no. I said, "What'd you do that for?" He said, "I don't want to be on the state school board." So a few days go by, a week goes by, and I hear from Johnny again. He's like, "Heard from Zell again." I was like, "Really?" I said, "What do you have to say?" He said, "Well," "he wants me to be chairman of the state school board." I said, "Well, how's he going to do that?" He said, "That's what I asked him." He said he's going to fire the whole board, and said that if I'd give him a list of people to put on the board, I'd have the votes. I said, "Seriously?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you know where all these districts are?" Because, the governor appoints by district. I said, "Of course I do." So I go to the real estate office, and we start going through a list of different people that had supported Johnny in 90 or 96 to suggest to Zell. And we suggested Brenda Fitzgerald. We suggested Larry Thompson. We suggested the guy over in Augusta. And Zell appointed them all.
So Johnny's on the Board of Education following that 96 race. 99, he replaces Newt Gingrich.
Yep.
Sort of a 180-degree turn in the 6th district. 2002, the Democratic majority in Georgia declined suddenly and then rapidly. Mm-hmm. Why was 2002 the turning point, in your estimation?
I think there were several factors. One is everything is in politics. There are personalities that particularly outsized personalities that impact it. Governor Barnes had pined so long for that job and being able to run the state that they got more than a little arrogant, in my opinion, in the way that they dealt with some issues. Not that they were wrong, it was just the way that they handle people and the way that they let certain people that had been loyal to them run amok. Probably the worst thing that happened to Roy Barnes and his entire administration was the ascendancy of Charles Walker. People want to blame Bobby for some of the problems that Roy had. I blame Charles Walker.
This is Bobby Kahn.
Yeah. I blame Charles Walker because his arrogance, particularly. But in my estimation, in being there watching what was going on, I was a lobbyist in the Capitol at that time. Charles Walker was a cancer on the body politic, and Governor Barnes continued to cut him slack. Bobby would cut him slack. But he was driving deep wedges inside his own caucus to the point that people were ready to do anything to make things change. And Sonny was one of those. And had it not been for Charles Walker, I'm not sure Sonny would have changed parties, when he did. But that was clearly one of the great successes of the leadership at the party at that time, was to see the opportunity to get Sonny to switch. Mm-hmm. I don't know that Sonny switched thinking, I'm going to be governor one day. I think he switched because he was just tired of having to deal with Charles Walker and all the ineptitude, the corruption, and he was a really bad person, and yet the Democrat Party propped him up, and I think that was one of the things that drove some of this and drove some of Governor Barnes's key allies, into a state of not being as much of an asset to him as they should have been. And they did it because they believed that Charles was one of those people that helped deliver the election to them before. But I think that was part of the unwritten story, if you will, People like to talk about the flag and some of the other things that were going on. Teachers being upset. You know, if Charles Walker had not been driving Roy Barnes, driving some of those divisive forces there, I'm not sure 2002 would have turned out the way that it did.
Why or how was a Charles Walker able to maintain control if, as you're saying, there are so many divisions within?
Well, I think there was an arrogance that it didn't matter.
Okay.
People that we're bigger than all this, and we'll let Charles do what Charles wants, and we'll be fine because Roy was going to drive right on to election. I also think that some of the wrong lessons were learned by their side in Roy's first election. I think that they didn't see some of the the ascendancy of the party as it was, and I think they thought, oh gosh, we can, we beat, and in that campaign we beat Milner, so we can carry on, and I don't think they saw that, and clearly we didn't see it. We didn't see some of those things that we should have. Or we probably would have put up a different candidate. But Sonny had the guts and the determination and the fight in him to say, even if I lose, I'm gonna make a statement about this.
How important was the geographic diversity in the Republican candidates? With Sonny Perdue being from Bon Air in Middle Georgia, Saxby being from Moultrie in South Georgia, that these weren't your stereotypical Buckhead, East Cobb Republicans.
Well, if you go back to Isakson's campaign in '90 and saw the success that we had in some of those areas, I mean, the building blocks were there, and so then you take one of their own and put it up. I don't think you can undervalue that. I think that you make a good point that it was part of the success and part of the winning coalition. And in the intervening years, rather, you had Coverdale's win, and
re-elect,
and he did well, in South Georgia. So I think there was some signs there that it was all possible.
So I guess that the meta questions are why Georgia Democrats were able to hold on so long, one. And what were the key or decisive factors that enabled Republican control?
Well, I think Democrats were able to hold on for so long because a lot of people saw running as a Democrat is the way to win. And so there were a lot of people. I remember even from my time, back in the 80s, trying to convince people to run for the legislature as Republican. Good candidates ran as Democrats because they thought that's the way to run and be effective. So you had a lot of people there that really didn't care about the party except it being a vehicle, people to win and be effective. And Skin would tell you the same thing, I think. If you look back and talk about some of the people that he served with that would sidle up to him and say, I could be a Republican if you guys,
Well, he said he was actually recruited by both parties.
He was.
And he was just like, yeah. He was a Republican.
Yep. So I think that was part of it, and just we got to a point where there were we got some parity with resources that also allowed a lot of people run. And I got to give some of the folks on the so-called Christian right, because they had the gumption and the desire to step forward and serve.
How much of it can you attribute to the Republican Party actually had to build an honest-to-goodness party apparatus, as opposed to the Democratic Party of Georgia, which is hold a Jefferson Jackson dinner, throw a barbecue, expect people to turn out?
I think there's something to that. I still don't think that the party apparatus, I actually think the party apparatus as it was in the late 80s and early 90s was stronger than it was when Sonny won. I think what started to happen, we started winning congressional races in particularly 94, those races that won there. You had members of Congress who had honest-to-God organizations in those districts. Charlie Norwood, there was a Norwood organization. Jack Kingston, there was a Kingston, organization. Linder, had his group. Matt Collins had, that group down there. So you had all these, and then Saxby, having been first a congressman, and then decided to run for the Senate. You had people out there that there were organizations, those congressional districts, that helped, support the party organization as it was. And you had members of Congress who were able to attend a county Republican event or that kind of thing, and made it real. And people began to get a little bit of taste of success that then fueled, a statewide run.
How much the resources with when you always hear like the Atlanta business establishment or the business establishment, how were Republicans simply closed off from those resources until they held a modicum of power?
They totally were. Most of those resources are incumbent,
regardless of label. Thinking about how the party has changed, how would you describe the policy focus, the policy interest of the Georgia Republican Party? If ignoring individual members, is there one key, identifying trait of the party that its priorities?
I don't think so. I think what's happened is that as people got elected and that the party has taken on the personality of whoever is the key standard bearer. We saw it through Sonny. We're now seeing it with Nathan. We see it with Johnny. We saw it with Saxby. We're beginning to see it with David Perdue as people identify with his brand of politics, and people are following that type of leadership. And those are all different thought leaders of their of their own design. They all have different styles, every one of them.
And David Ralston, we can speak
David
of
being another great one, because David and David is David like Johnny and Saxby are a true product of the sort of the farm system that's out there. David being in the state senate, then running statewide, serving the state house, being part of that. So I think that is a bigger driving factor than any single issue.
What do you think the Georgia Republican Party has held the governor's mansion since 2003? State Senate fell shortly after that with Jack Hill and the other party switchers.
Which again was Charles Walker. That was that helped drive those folks to flip.
Really, because Jack Hill's Reedsville.
Yep.
So very.
Dan Lee despised Charles Walker. They had several head-to-head clashes. So the ones that switched, Rooney to a little bit lesser extent, but those are the three. It was easy.
Cheeks the
Cheeks.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the State House fell in 2004, 2005. Right. Every statewide constitutional office in 2010, since 2010. Utter dominance, supermajorities. I believe that we're still at supermajorities. What's the threat to the governing majority, the Republicans' governing majority in the state?
I think we're seeing some of the fissures of it with the so-called religious freedom discussion. RFRA. I think that the threat now is there is not I don't think you can identify a single Republican Party in Georgia. I think there's three parties, maybe four. And the
Walk me through those factions.
But the idea that the Georgia Republican Party and the business community are in lockstep, is far from being the reality that some people think it is. And when I identify different types of Republican Party, there is you've got the suburban Republicans who tend to be more moderate. You've got the ex-urban Republicans.
So you're Forsyth County, Cherokee,
exactly.
Bartow.
Yep. And then you've got a South Georgia Republican that's different than a Mountain Georgia Republican, and they as and I think Governor Deal has done a great favor to the party by focusing some leadership on the transportation issue, because I think that was definitely a fissure out there, and it still will be.
Sure.
Because at some point, people were going to wake up and say, wait a minute, I've been voting for these guys all these years, and it's not any easier for me to get to work, and my kids aren't getting any better education. And by the way, I'm not paying any less in taxes. You know, and that if that moment, you know, were to gel, if it were to gel in this next election or the one after that, then, you know, the party will pay the price.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what's happening, is there's a lot of divisions under that heading.
What about demographic change? Are you one of the subscribers to the demographics as destiny in politics, as a former operative or an operative in general? You can read demographic tea leaves.
Yep.
Where is Georgia headed demographically, and what are the partisan consequences?
You know, if we as a Republican Party don't find a way to speak to some of these different demographic groups that you're talking about, particularly as it relates to Latinos and Asian Americans, in my opinion, you know, we've long talked about trying to speak to, you know, the African American community, and it just hasn't happened, and I don't
Sure.
think anybody can suggest it's going to happen now. But we truly need to speak to our roots as the defender of entrepreneurship, and if we do that, particularly in those communities, I think that we can have some success. And I'm encouraged that there's that opportunity with the current chairman of the party, because he understands the need to have that kind of outreach. But it's going to have to be organic, and there's going to have to be a real dedicated effort to it. The difficulty for a chairman of this party now is that there are fewer people that are inclined to get involved in the party apparatus,
Sure.
because they have so many other ways to get involved with people that are making real decisions about the direction of government.
Are we talking social networking, the Tea Party, such as the Tea Party
Mm-hmm.
still is, that, you know, you don't have to get, and I guess we're talking, you know, post-Citizens United world too,
Right.
that there are just other opportunities or
Well,
other influences?
in a lot of ways, we've been the victim of our own success.
Okay.
And micro-targeting and its impact on reapportionment is huge. There are more incumbents that have to be concerned about their next primary than there are those that have to be concerned about their next general election.
Mm-hmm.
In the last general election for this legislature, there were more incumbents who had primary opposition than had general election opposition.
I think I read Georgia is the least competitive legislature in the general.
Yeah. And that so what we've done with this micro-targeting piece and creating all these safe districts is we've created a lot of districts that will never be competitive from a party standpoint. So the fight will be in who needs to get further to the right. Or on the Democrat side, they have the same problem. You know, they've got to get further to the left. Look at what Stacey Abrams is talking about in this governor's race. I mean, she is talking like a California Democrat, you know, to a Georgia electorate. And why is that? Because that's the way she wins the primary. Does it mean she's a better general election candidate? I don't think so. You know, but the same thing could happen to us if we're not careful. And the religious freedom issue is one of those issues. The immigration issue is another one of those issues. And both those issues, you know, cut at what should be natural allies of ours, in my opinion.
I think it's the Georgia Republican Assembly, the Alex Johnson's group, convinced all the gubernatorial candidates so far to sign on to a pledge saying that they would sign a religious freedom bill. Is that a symptom of what you're talking about in terms of the primary?
Sure is.
That,
and I don't even know who the Georgia Republican Assembly is.
It's one of those other avenues
Yeah,
to
right.
affect change that we were talking
I mean,
about.
are these all the people that couldn't get elected Republican Party chairman? That formed their own group that they can be chairman of? Yeah. But yes, it is.
So, one of the major pitches out there now, or positions for candidates, especially here in Georgia, special election races here in the Athens area, Democrats are proposing that an independent commission draw legislative and congressional districts. Would that help solve the issue?
Well, probably, but it's nothing more than an academic exercise at this point. I remember that the problem is I'm old enough to remember when that we proposed that years and years ago because we saw no other way to impact the process, and it was a pipe dream then as it is now. You can't you can't expect a legislative body to hand over control of that to anybody outside, and short of the Supreme Court saying it's going to happen, it won't happen here. But it's an interesting academic discussion.
Well, I'll pause it for a second. So 2018, there's going to be an open seat in the governor's mansion. Nathan Deal, term limited, going to be retiring. We've already mentioned briefly the Democratic race, and even though you're a Republican operative, can you assess the state of the Democratic Party and maybe it's a great lens to view the Georgia Democratic Party is this primary showdown between Stacey Evans and Stacey Abrams. What's your assessment of the candidates?
Well, I see a lot of parallels to where we were in the 80s, frankly, is that you've got some young candidates that are staking out positions to try and promote themselves, promote ideas and issues that I can't believe they really think that that's the path to win in a general election. But they're on that path because they think, okay, if maybe I got to run and lose to be able to run and win. And certainly Stacey Abrams sounds like, a candidate running for statewide office, in California. Stacey Evans, on the other hand, the video that her campaign put together to introduce her to Georgia voters should strike fear in the heart of any Republican operative in Georgia. That message is beautiful, it is simple, and there's a lot of folks that can relate to it from the Hope Scholarship point of view. And she is extremely articulate in that. I don't know that she gets there, but there's a lot of people that have run and lost that then run and win, and that's part of what I see happening there. Their bench is very thin, and it's
too non-existent.
It's unfortunate. Frankly, I hope they both stay in that race because it's good for Republicans that they're arguing with each other about who's more left of center. But Stacey Evans has tremendous potential, long term, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I think that she, her personal story and her drive are the kind of things that, as a former consultant, you look for. That's the kind of candidate I want to work for.
Do you think being from Cobb County, which is, used to be a 70-30 Republican county,
right.
We're now talking 54,
right.
46, 52, 48 Republican county. Do you think that those inner suburbs, Cobb, Gwinnett, DeKalb's already clearly in the Democratic camp. Do you think that transit, Henry County as well, that's going to fuel candidates like Stacey Evans?
Well, that's part of the lesson that we should learn as Republicans from the Ossoff campaign. Is that here you take a guy who was an unknown And all of a sudden there's all these people that were willing to support him. I mean, and he has no
$35 million.
right, and it's not just the money. And the money made
That's a fair
some of the
point.
votes, but it's the actual votes he got that's more impressive to me.
48.1% in the 6th district.
In an area that is supposed to be a strong Republican district.
Is to move away from the gubernatorial race to talk about Ossoff, since you brought it up, is that purely a reaction to Donald Trump, or is that the catalyst that sort of set off or highlighted the demographic structural changes in Metro Atlanta?
I think what it shows you is the potential for the Democrat Party, and were it not for reapportionment being what it is, then that shows you there is a constituency there that will respond. So, I mean, the dynamics of that race, I don't want to say this, I'm trying to think the way I want to say this. It's obvious the constituency is there. There's not a vehicle for it yet.
The constituency, I just want to unpack that for a second. Is that college-educated, upwardly mobile, young professional whites plus
right, and it shows you
minorities?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it shows you what's there. If those folks, if there's a candidate that can give voice to those type voters, and it also shows you some of the failings that we as a Republican Party have had in communicating to some of those same constituencies that we should be a party of their future. And it also shows you the state of the American electorate is that everybody is pissed off about something.
Oh, sure.
And that's becoming more of that's the whole Trump phenomenon, is that no matter what he says, there's people out there that agree with him. Scary as that is.
How was Donald Trump? Was it the fact that there were 97 Republicans running? I've always labored under the belief that an excess of democracy in the candidate selection process is the only explanation for how Donald Trump wins the nomination.
Well, and he came into the race with his own media profile.
That he was such a known, not necessarily a known quantity, because there are still a lot of unknowns about Donald Trump. That it was just, he was 37% of the primary electorate?
It'd be the same thing if Mark Cuban runs on the other side.
Sure.
He comes into the race with a base, a name ID, that people can relate to at some level or another. It shows how, and we've seen this in other countries, the entertainment industry contributing, candidates to the political. But I think that with Trump, I do think it was a function of there being so many candidates. And he was always, Atwater famously said that the Republican electorate in a presidential primary can never focus on more than 3 candidates at any time. He called it the milk stool theory of presidential politics. 3 legs to the milk stool. So Trump always had one of those. And at any given time, the other 2 legs were being shared by 12 other candidates, at different points in time. And it accrued to his benefit.
You were talking about the Republican Party being the party it needs to be the party of the future. I don't think it's clear what Donald Trump's governing agenda is, if there is one, or if it's just sort of a malleable thing. But it does seem the one constant is economic nationalism, protectionism. How can the Republican Party, and eventually it will force down ballot Republicans in Georgia and elsewhere to reconcile this as well. How does the Republican Party of a Reagan-Bush, which is embracing globalism, embracing free trade, embracing immigration reform, but immigration. How can that be reconciled with a Donald Trump, Steve Bannon worldview?
I think it can be. I think that one side or the other is going to win, and when that happens, then we'll have to deal with the fallout, But I think until the majority pays a price for the extremism that's being forced on it, again through these members that have to be more concerned about winning their primary. When Jeff Flake didn't quit because he was worried about the general election. He was worried because he just
Kelly Ward
didn't want to put the time in to fight a bloody primary that would either lead to him losing the seat in the primary or the general. And he was like, why do I need to put myself through this? And he won't be the last one.
I think there's the misconception that it's only moderates or centrists that are going to retire. Jeff Flake is no moderate.
Jeff Flake is a conservative.
Very, very conservative. Bob Corker, not quite as conservative as Jeff Flake, but still a conservative.
I'm actually, the most encouraging sign I see out there is the Gillespie campaign in Virginia right now. If Gillespie wins, then there will have to be some attention paid to how he did it in a state that Trump didn't carry, in a state that has not elected a Republican statewide in a while. And so how did Gillespie...
Bob McDonnell.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, but how did Gillespie do it? And Gillespie's obviously not out there promoting Trumpism, whatever that is, as some people think they have to do to win other statewide elections. So I'm actually encouraged by that development, but there's too few of those, too few Ed Gillespies out there.
And draw how many conclusions can be drawn from the an off year, New Jersey and Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the reconciling at the national level, but here in Georgia, it seems like at least on the Republican side, that Casey Cagle's running. He's been lieutenant governor since 2007. A pair of state senators, Hunter Hill and Mike Williams, both from the Atlanta area, and Secretary of State Brian Kemp from here in Athens. Is Casey Cagle, who's obviously the front runner, name ID, is this another John Oxendine who
No.
was way out in front in 2009, 2010?
No, I don't think so. I think the field is one of the weakest fields we've had for governor in a lot of years.
Even with a sitting lieutenant governor?
That being the exception. But you take Casey out of it. Casey is the major domo right now, because of his tenure of service and the fact that he's he's basically taken the same path that Zell took. He's built up his brand over a period of time and under two different administrations. But I think what's missing from this whole conversation is here we are with probably the most successful governor of our lifetime, certainly of my lifetime, in Nathan Deal. And nobody is yet saying, I'm going to carry that torch forward. I want, if you liked Nathan Deal, you're going to love what I can do. Because here's Nathan, he's led on not just job creation, economic growth, but he inherited a state budget that was basically broke. He turned it around. He's going to leave $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund, all-time record job creation, and then he goes off on the side over here because and there's no political constituency for this, but he has one of the most visionary criminal justice reform packages of any governor of our lifetime. He completely resets the deck on what it means to serve your time and then come back to the community. It's just absolutely...
Or to be diverted from the process entirely.
And and nobody's even talked about what the budgetary impact of that is long term for the states.
Well, you were involved in the 1980s when corrections and
Exactly.
how many prisons.
So the thing that surprises me most about 2018 so far is that nobody is saying, this governor's done a great job, and here's what I'm going to do to build on it.
How much of that is the fact that Governor Deal has run afoul of certain highly energized elements of the Republican Party by vetoing religious liberty bills, by vetoing the original, much broader campus carry bill? So you think that because the primary electorate is what the primary electorate is, that by embracing Nathan Deal, the baggage will be more, will be heavier than the burden will be greater than the benefit. There we go. I finally got it out.
Yeah, if were I advising a candidate on how to beat Casey Cagle, I would go from the angle of how can he continue to deliver like this governor has? Instead, they're coming from a completely different direction that wants to take the state down a different path. And the governor's last poll I looked at, the governor's job approval rate is somewhere in the 70s.
Bill Clinton numbers from the 90s.
I mean, he's got great numbers, and he's not going to. You don't have to worry about saying good things about him and then him endorsing the other guy, because he's not going to do that. That's not Nathan Deal. So it really, that's the perplexing part of this race to me so far, is that nobody has said, you know what, this governor's done a great job. We ought to be thankful for that, and here's what we can do to build on it.
Looking down the road, what does the Republican Party look like 10, 20 years from now here in Georgia? The national level, I'm not sure what it looks like next week.
I do think that if you look at the makeup of the legislature now, and where the leadership in that legislature comes from, a lot of the folks that are in that will be committee chairs or could be leading the legislature are in that exurbia, South Georgia, North Georgia type thing. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to manage the chasm that's there between what Metro Atlanta needs to continue to be the economic engine that drives success for the rest of the state, and square that with their local politics. And that's the real conundrum, folks. And we're seeing some of that with some of the discussions about tax incentives and tax credits and that kind of thing. I think it really gets put to the test on the Amazon deal if we happen to win there, because that will show a very bright light on things that often aren't talked about, with that degree of specificity.
Meaning what?
Well, I think
more
that
specifically,
if you start looking at what Amazon is asking for,
the inducements,
okay, yeah, then it becomes, fortunately, it's not a package, on the whole that has to be submitted to the legislature for a vote in an election year. Now, pieces of it may have to. I've been told, I haven't seen it, but I've been told that there's parts of it that will require some kind of legislative action.
Transportation related?
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Rural Georgia is continuing to shrink population-wise. Economic prospects have been dim since the early post-World War II period. The decline of the end of the county unit system dried up a lot of economic and political resources. Wedding white rural Georgia with the suburban metropolitan voter base of the Republican Party arguably enabled the Republicans to seize power in 2002 and hold it statewide, beginning in the early 90s and onward. Is there a point where rural whites ever leave the Republican Party, as they did the Democratic Party?
I think there would have to be some major economic event
Okay.
that acts as the catalyst for that.
Mm-hmm. Because that seems, when we're talking about the Democratic candidates, Stacey Evans and Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams is clearly doubling down on the base of the Republican Party, which is a majority-minority party.
Well, keep in mind that in the last gubernatorial election, it was the first time in modern Georgia political history that the economy and jobs was listed as the #1 issue over education. For as long as I can remember,
Oh, sure.
for as many polls
Sure.
as I've looked at in 30 years in this business, it was always education. And that was completely supplanted by the economy and jobs. So that's why I say it would take an economic event of some consequence to change that equation.
What they call a critical event, not necessarily a secular realignment.
Yep.
Well, Jay Morgan, do you have anything else? I mean, we're over 2 hours now.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
No, absolutely not. We appreciate it. Wide-ranging discussion. Anything else you want to get down for posterity's sake before we sign off?
I love my children.
That always, Margot, I love you too. I'll just get that one in there too. Thank you very much for participating. The Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much, sir.